Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm your host, Deb Philman. At The Reason We Learn, we aspire to be part of the solution. The purpose of this show is to take a good, honest, potentially painful look at the way kids are being educated. We know we can do better, and this is where we'll talk about how. Let's learn something. Hi, everybody. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. If you are new to this channel and interested in being part of the solution to our education crisis, I hope you'll subscribe to be notified when I make new content. Please also like and share this broadcast so others can benefit from the information we're about to share and even join us live. If you're watching in the replay, thank you for tuning in. I hope you'll find this as valuable. It should be evergreen information. This is a topic that will be dominating the headlines and our lives and so-called school reform for a long time. So whenever you happen to be watching this, welcome. Each of these shows is an opportunity to hear from people who are working to improve education and defend individual liberty any way they can, and this one is no exception. Courtenay Turner is the host of the Courtenay Turner Podcast. She is also a speaker and aerial acrobatic performer. Having spent her academic career largely steeped in the world of philosophical and psychological texts and being a passionate athlete and performing artist, paved the way for the world in which she is currently immersed. Many today know her as the host of that podcast, Courtenay Turner Podcast, where she boldly seeks truth, diving into myriad of topics surrounding issues of health, fitness, medicine, philosophy, psychology, politics, geopolitics, and sociocultural zeitgeist. She has a book coming out actually this month as well, and we can talk to her about that. I encourage you to subscribe to her podcast. You will learn so very much, okay? Tonight, Courtenay is joining me to talk about school choice and some of the most annoyingly enduring myths that surround it. In particular, we're going to tackle the myths that dominate on the supposedly conservative side of the argument. Many of you have probably heard arguments from the left, from Democrats, from the teachers' unions, and we're not really going to dive too much into that. I mean, we might touch on it here and there, but primarily we are targeting those who are telling parents, this is the conservative solution. This is the free market solution. This is the parental rights-oriented solution. So we're going to talk about that and the myths around that. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Courtenay to the stage. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for having me back.
Thank you for coming back. I never know. After I have a guest one time, like, sure, come back. But I think last time we had a great show and I think people learned a lot. So I would expect the same this evening. So before the show, Courtenay and I traded some messages back and forth trying to come up with the myths that we would cover. And we came up with, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, sort of 5 that we're going to talk about. They range from sort of economic considerations to sort of pedagogical considerations. I would imagine you've probably heard them all. So shall we just dive right in?
Yes, let's dive right in.
Let's just dive right in. The first one, the big one. It's a free market solution, Courtenay.
Yeah, I think that this is probably the biggest lie of all because, it's free market. This is the big lie that I'm hearing kind of all around because I've been diving into something called Game B, and that's led me down a lot of different trails because they talk about, DeFi, decentralized finance, and that's another big buzzword. And so you're hearing this kind of overlap in all these different sectors, like in medicine, in technology, in finance, and then of course here with the school choice issue. And really it's very deceptive because, again, like we talked about this last time, the word choice, it's so appealing to people who are freedom minded, people who identify on the political right, whether it be conservative, libertarian. They hear the word choice and they think, great, this is freedom, and I have the power in my hands. But of course, this is just clever marketing, and it is anything but choice because we're talking about putting everything under the umbrella of the government. And I think in some ways it's even worse because when you start privatizing things, you start seeing this. First of all, things become very clandestine, right? A lot of private organizations cannot be, investigated, and they're not as transparent in the same kind of way. Not just government always is. Of course, we have our classified arenas, but oftentimes there are trails. There's at least some section that is required to be public. But really, what it is a vehicle for this public-private partnerships. And in some ways, that's even more tyrannical than just a state government or even federal governments in many ways, because now it's even more centralized. You're talking about a global apparatus, and of course, as we talked about last time, this is all an extension of the World Core Curriculum UN agenda, which is explicitly to execute the visions of Alice Bailey, in her Education in the New Age. And of course, she also outlined lots of this in her Externalization of the Hierarchy, which was very inspirational to Robert Mueller, who created the World Core Curriculum. And he explicitly says this is about creating global citizens. So this decentralized idea, that it's going to be, this marketplace of education, I think couldn't be further from the truth. And then when you start looking at all these various public-private partnerships and what happens with school choices, you've got all these funding entities that are tied to it, right? And they're going to be creating these various partnerships. So now you have a specific healthcare provider you have to work with for your child. There's a specific transportation. They can't be just taken to school by you, or, gosh forbid you let your children walk to school if they're close enough, that would be deemed you're not a fit parent, or, possibly a reason for CPS to come in. And now they'd have means of oversight over that, which is a, entryism for them to come and, play co-parent. But, it could be with the uniforms, the list goes on and on, but it's going to be money that's specifically designated. And my real concern is that it is tied to this DeFi agenda, which is really part of the tokenized, gamified economy. And we know they've already beta tested so much of this, putting children on the blockchain ledger, doing all of this tech ed kind of data mining. And it's a cybernetic feedback loop that's programming them as well as, data mining them. So, yeah.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the fact that it may be more tyrannical, ironically, than the public system we have now, which, of course, I abhor and I would like to abolish. I want to make sure everybody understands that. At no time should you take from this program that I will only speak for myself here. Courtney can speak for herself, that I prefer or support, government run education. I don't. It's a conflict of interest. I think it's unconstitutional. I think it's all bad things. But what I want people to understand is school choice is still government education. It's not a free market solution. As Courtney said, what you are simply doing is allowing, I really try to frame it this way. You're passing laws They don't so much force you, mom and dad, to do something. They give permission. Remember, our Constitution was to restrict what the government was allowed to do. So school choice bills now give permission to the government to go places it was not previously allowed to go. It gives them permission to use your tax dollars that might have been, earmarked for education or maybe something else entirely. And, kind of give them to private corporations to invest in, whatever they want to. Now, you might assume those private corporations share your values, share your policy. You may be one of those people that goes, corporation equals free market. Since when? Okay. So, and we have precedent here. Healthcare, Obamacare. Remember, you can, if you like your plan, you can keep your plan. If you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. And not only did it completely changed the landscape of private insurance, even if you didn't go into the exchange. Suddenly private insurance jacked up like crazy. But also the entire practice of medicine changed very fast.
And here's the thing. I mean, this may sound kind of crazy, but I really have all the evidence to back this up. This is part of a very long-range plan that is a transhuman agenda. And I know you throw that into education, it's like, okay, where are we going here? But you brought up Obamacare, and there's a lot of people are familiar with the Policy Horizons document that came out in Canada, right? It's called Biodigital Convergence. Well, way earlier, because that was in 2020 and back in Obama days, and you can find this, I posted it on Twitter, but you can just go to the Obama White House, archives.com, I believe it is, and you'll find it, and it's called Converging Technologies. And this was under Obama. And this was the whole infrastructure for Obamacare. And it was all about AI precision medicine, right? That's really what it was about. It was about this, merging this biotech industry. And it was about setting up this infrastructure that this company Maximus was largely behind all the, having everything, documented, medical documentation and technological infrastructure for medicine. And that's what Obamacare was really paving the way for. And of course, now we've got Project Stargate. So you see where I'm going here. But the same thing is going on in education, right? We have all of these voucher systems that go all the way back to the 70s, right? With the American what was it, Council Institute and all the Koch brother organizations, really. It's like the whole Mont Pelerin Society and Americans for Prosperity. I call them Americans for Propaganda, but this goes way back, this agenda. And now what we're seeing is they are building AI precision education. And this is this is the agenda. So you put it, but what they need to do is they need to get exactly the opposite of freedom. So they need you to feel like you get to choose. Oh, I have a buffet. I could go to public school. I can send my kids to private school. I could homeschool. And now you have this illusion that you have made this choice. But what happens? You're still subject to a uniform regulations, whether it be the uniforms, whether it be the wellness checks, and you have to comply with various
Right.
check marks of it could be whatever medical interventions they decide, or it could be with the curriculum. So you may say you don't like things like critical race theory and you don't want that to be part of your child's education, but even if you're a homeschooler, you now have to gear towards whatever the testing is, right? So you have to be
if you take the money. And
what a lot of it doesn't even matter if you take the money.
I was about to get to that. That's kind of like myth number 6 that I forgot to put on the list, which is that everything we're about to tell you with all the other myths won't apply if you don't take the money. So we'll get to that. But I want to be very clear that it starts just like Obamacare. Don't go in the exchange. Don't take the subsidy. Then it won't affect you. And we know what happened. It affected every single one of us, whether we were using exchange policies or not. It literally changed the market. So a free market is not top-down changed by taxpayer dollars. I mean, it just doesn't happen. That's not it. Taxpayer dollars don't exist in a free market. The government isn't doing any redistribution. That is individuals making individual choices without somebody guiding them, steering them, or giving them a menu. That's not how it works. The menu is whatever. It's all out there.
Right.
And you could even make it up as you go along. I mean, if you didn't pay these taxes in the first place towards education, and if you weren't compelled by the government to let them know what your plans are for education, the free market for education would be practically limitless. I mean, because what isn't education after a point, if you can argue that it is. So this myth really needs to die. It is not a free market solution. It is a taxpayer-funded government bureaucratic program that is growing the education bureaucracy exponentially. Whatever they tell you, if they tell you it's budget neutral, whatever, no, it's not. That's also a lie. They're just moving some deck chairs around on the Titanic to make it look that way, but it is opening up a third lane for more money. And if you had hopes in your state of getting rid of property taxes, no, goodbye to that, because nothing in the school choice bills is actually doing away with any of the mandates for providing public school. Those will still exist. They still need to be funded, and they will still have their very powerful political lobbyists demanding to be fully funded. And once you create lane 3, you will have the new group of lobbyists demanding that ESAs be fully funded. And this will make private school, homeschool, a perpetual political football, which is the antithesis of free market economics.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's all done. I think the sleight of hand with what's going on, and I see this across the board again, but specifically in education here, is that people are given this illusion. So they think they actually have choice, and they're choosing from the buffet, but the buffet is still, I mean, the buffet can all be poisoned. So,
That's right.
and they can
That's
only
right.
eat from that buffet. And
Well,
so,
and when they're telling you can only eat from, Golden Corral, and you're like,
yeah,
the quality sucks. Like, I don't care that
yes,
there's 75,000 choices at Golden Corral. I
right.
would rather go over here to whatever or cook at home.
Or get
I
home.
don't want to eat at Golden Corral.
And that's just it. They need to do this to tie it so that there is no there is nothing that is outside of the government education.
Right.
It makes all education government education.
Yes,
And
it
that's
does.
really the agenda. So they can create the global citizen so that they're grooming this, and also so they can do this data mining feedback loop, cybernetic, and it is part
Right.
of a transhuman agenda.
Well,
That's
and
just
before we move to the next one, I want to hit on one important thing because you did mention it. You said can be more tyrannical.
yes.
People tend to think that private corporations don't in any way, control us or have any, it's like up to us to be good little consumers. And I would agree with that most of the time when they're funding their own endeavors. But when they're rent seeking,
Yep.
okay,
What
which
this
is
is.
what this will be doing, then it's a different story
Right.
because now what is happening is they are going to work hand in glove with the government. What do you want us to make them do? Okay, you want us to do that? Okay, so we'll get the money when we make them do this. Okay, so there will be this incestuous little relationship where they want the money because remember that's the investment seed money for their corporation.
Right.
It's not like this is ExxonMobil. Okay, these are going to be new corporations and ed tech companies and even offshoots and NGOs and things like that. So they need the taxpayer money. They are going to be allowed to make profit. That's not coming back to us, the taxpayers. They're going to make profit. So they're incentivized to tell the government whatever the government wants to hear, whoever's in power at the time, whatever, so they can get hold of the money. So they're actually extending the government's reach into something that appears to be private. They'll be able to profit from it, which what? And then they can put their own little restrictions in to make you do things they want you to do, which is a whole layer of stuff that now you think to yourself, in order to get some of my tax money back, I'm going to have to please EdTech Corporation. So not just the government that gave them the money, but I got to please them too. How? And you can't vote them out of office. Like you can't get rid of them.
No, and I'll just layer on top of that. So when you're talking about these corporations, we're not talking about mom and pop shops. That's not who's going to be given these private public partnership deals, right? We're
Right.
talking about supranational organizations, and who are they subject to? I think the best example is 4 years ago when people wanted to have liberties over their own bodily functions, and if you went into a mom and pop shop, you might be able to. You could possibly negotiate with a family business and,
Yep.
decide if you wanted to walk in with a naked face. And that they might decide the bottom line was more important to them than following some of these measures because that was their purview. And some of them unfortunately went under as a result. But when you went into a big box store, you were subject to all of it. And why? Because they're answering to these big NGOs. So this is what happens. So now you're actually taking something that is a federal kind of
Mhm.
initiative, and now it's becoming a supranational
That's right.
initiative. And so that's why I say it's even more tyrannical because now we're answering to. Do you want the UN to dictate our education? I personally don't. I think our federal government's doing a poor enough job. But yeah, and again, I'm with you. I don't like public education. I would never want to send my children there if I could avoid it. I understand everybody makes their choices and some schools are better, some systems, everybody does what's right for them, but I'm not a fan at all. However, I think UN run education would be a million times worse. And then they have to answer all these big corporations. They get incentivized through all of these ESG scores. And, now we have B corporations, there's like 6,000. Ben and Jerry's is an example of a B corporation. They have something called an SDG adapter. So it measures their scores. And Ben and Jerry's is now putting out all of these videos saying, we're not an ice cream company. We're an activism organization. It's because
That sells ice cream.
that happens to sell ice cream. Right.
Right.
But
Exactly.
this is what education is going to be subject to. Do we
Right.
want that?
And then
No.
they're all going to be salivating at the opportunity to get involved in the education business, but not with their own money. Mind you, I have no problem if a company, even Ben and Jerry says, I want to open a Ben and Jerry's activism school with our money. and we're going to offer scholarships and we're going to do this and it's going to cost X amount. If people want to take their kids to the Ben and Jerry's activism school, it's not my business. Freedom of speech,
Yeah.
right? Freedom of association. But
you
the
have
minute,
that choice that you don't have to send your kids.
that's correct. And even though, and there'll be people say, but you don't have to send your kids to one of these schools with the vouchers. You'll send your kid to another school with the voucher. The problem is they're going to standardize these things top down in order for them to participate. And it's in the government's best interest to do this. They will standardize just like they standardize private schools. Private schools at this point are private in name only to a large degree, even though they don't currently get, except in some states, a lot of voucher money, whatever, they will get more. And even before getting any, they have accreditation, and their accreditation companies are in lockstep with the government.
Yep.
Okay, so just think of this as more accreditation coming from both government and private entities, but now it's funded by your tax dollars. It's not what you think it is. So that takes us to the next one, which is it will create competition. Public schools will be forced to compete for the money. How do you figure? How do you figure it, Courtney? How does that one even work? I mean, I think people need to go read some Thomas Sowell, Economics 101. But how about this?
Yeah. Well, first of all, if they're getting handed money, they're not competing for the money. I mean, yeah, where's the competition? And second of all, it makes everything uniform, right? Everything's standardized, as you said. So where's the competition in that? That's not fostering. Now we're just all aligning with a certain standard and certain, initiatives. So but you're not competing to be the best. You're just checking boxes, essentially.
Right.
So if anything, it could be doing the opposite of fostering competition. I think it kills a lot of competition, because now it limits the pool. It's only within this umbrella, which, in my state, we actually have umbrellas, like umbrella schools. And that's unfortunately what ropes all of the homeschooling is under umbrella category. And what we see happening there is it absolutely reduces competition, because now everybody is subject to the same standards. And unfortunately, then they have the same problems that you see in some of these public schools, where the results of their education have declined and deteriorated tremendously, because they're subject to the standardization. So it's the exact opposite of fostering competition. And now also it's like people are just so they can shift from one to the next. So the school doesn't have to compete to be better, right?
Well, or they'll compete on things that ultimately, as they do now, don't really have a lot to do with the quality of the instruction or the quality of the teaching or the things that you think you want to choose. So, right. So parents are thinking now, I want a better school, and they have some definition of better that they're working with. And what you may end up finding is that whatever you thought was better will quickly fall by the wayside, because in order to continue getting the money, the government will not allow them to continue doing things like selective admission, or not dealing with special needs kids, or not providing lunch, or, like you said, not providing transportation, which all gives them more money to use towards paying teachers or towards curriculum or something else.
Well,
and
they're
so
competing to get the money from the government, rather than competing to improve the quality of education.
correct. You, the parent, may, in the first phase, kind of like with Social Security or whatever, it's like, or even with Obamacare, first phase, I'm going to run out and get the best primary care doctor, or I'm going to go, and then they fill up. And now what do you do? Now, what do you do? So now even I think about, how do I choose my doctors? Because in theory, I have medical choice, right? And I do have private insurance, but it's still, because everything's been standardized now, even though I'm not getting any government subsidy, I'm subjected to the same standardization. And so now I'm picking things like wait times. Like, how long do I have to wait for an appointment? Is that medical care?
No.
How far away is the office from my home? Is that the care I'm getting? So it'll be the same thing with education. You think I'm going to get better education? Like, are you just going to be able to pick one that's, closer to your house?
Yeah.
Or provides better lunch, or has fewer fights in the hallway, maybe, for now.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, if your goal is actually higher standards for the students, better teachers, etc., then what you want is decentralization. You actually want each and every school to operate
decentralization, not the illusion of decentralization. I mean,
correct.
this term has been so bastardized, like they always do, right? They have their glossary that they work with, and then you think you're saying the same thing, but their definitions are entirely different. Yeah.
Exactly.
I think they're using the term decentralization in a very H.G. Wellian sense. H.G. Wells, in his book World Brain, he said the conduit to the world brain would be the decentralization of knowledge. So back then, he was talking about, universities and educational institutions and, vessels of information, that they would be decentralized, and that's what would create the world brain. And I think when they say decentralization, that's really what they're talking about.
Exactly. And so, it's important to remember what creates real competition and that this isn't that. This will not do that. This will not even allow it.
Mm-hmm.
So, when they say the dollars are going to follow the child, they mean it. That means that when the government says we're giving you this money for education, they're going to follow your kid wherever it goes. So whatever the government standard is, for you to have those dollars will follow you in the door of whatever building, whatever program, even to your own home.
Mm-hmm.
And that means where before you could close the door, before you could walk away from the building and go home, or go from this building to another building and no one was following you and watching over you, they mean it. The dollars following the children means we, the government, are following your child around to places we were not previously allowed to go.
Yes. And I think this opens the door for, what I was saying before, like, CPS, and for the government to be the third party to co-parent with the child, which is really scary. We don't want that. I don't want that.
Exactly. And so, and somebody mentioned in the comments that, school choice might create sort of competition for better kids. In other words, so the kids, it wasn't exactly what he said. He said that, the better kids are going to leave when they get school choice, the bad kids behind, whatever, if whatever your definition is, if it's well-behaved or smarter, and what I would submit to you as a tutor, so I see a lot of kids whose parents are dissatisfied and have been for years. They left a long time ago. They weren't waiting for vouchers. They weren't waiting for ESAs. They left. And those who don't have kids in school yet, you can't really evaluate. Are they the better kids? We don't know yet. They haven't gone into school. So if we're talking about kids who are currently in school, have been in school for a number of years, the ones who are exceedingly well-behaved are well-behaved wherever they go. I feel bad for them that they're surrounded by kids who aren't well-behaved, but I don't think their parents are waiting for a block of money to move them to a private school. They tend to move them before that, because if your kid is that well behaved, that means they're raised well in a home where parents care a lot about these issues and they prioritize their spending accordingly. Right. And then as far as the kids who are very smart, I mean, they exist in all populations, and they exist in schools that have, poor behavior and good behavior. The problem is money isn't solving this. Money, even if they take the money and they go to a different place, the fact that your kid is in a building with good kids or better kids won't matter at all in about a month if the school, if the administration, if the rules, if the teaching, if the pedagogy doesn't support those good kids.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, why do you think so many people are homeschooling now? Because even when they tried to go to private school, it wasn't a big enough move because they didn't have the support for their kids in those places. So it's not a function of the money.
We've seen some of the most well-funded schools with the
Yeah.
most poor outcome for education. This is, how are those funds being allocated?
That's right.
The question. It's not a matter of how much money is there. The
Exactly.
misappropriation of funds is quite rampant. So
and it really is the thing that makes a difference. So I think, we've basically explained why it's not competition. That also, the last thing I'll say is public schools are going to continue to get funded. Like I said before, the money isn't going away. You will hear from the left, you'll hear from Democrats, oh my God, they're taking our money away. This is scare tactics. They're not. They have to fund the schools for the students who are there. And so they're already rolling in money. They're like drowning in money in these public schools. As a lot of people have noted, even in the comments, they have administrators up the wazoo. They have, paraprofessionals. They have all these extra people. They have plenty of cuts they could make and still teach the kids without, anybody leaving. But if people are going to leave, even if they took all the money, which they're not doing, they only get a portion, they have fewer kids to teach. So it doesn't add up in terms of we're not going to be funded. They're going to be funded.
They'll be funded. They've been our biggest ally when I go and fight in my state capital, proverbially speaking, but when I'm advocating against school choice, it's been the Democrats who have been really our ally. They're fighting for a very different reason, though. And it is the argument that they make is that the funds are leaving the public schools. They're very concerned about that, which, as you just pointed out, is a total myth. And that is just absurd. That's not what's happening at all. The other thing that they're saying is that they want more standardization. They're concerned that, like, no, that's exactly why we don't want this. They're concerned.
But that's why it's going to happen.
Yeah,
because if you've got the government involved, that means it's inherently political. I think a lot of people in the Republican side, the conservative side, because that's on the ascendance, especially in Texas and places like that, they're like, yes, and it's going to be great and everything. It's like you assume that you're not going to have pressure from the other side being brought to bear politically, so that they're going to have both. Right. They're going to say, okay, let's add more standardization to make these people happy. Let's have another standardized test. And we already have seen it. We've already seen it in some of the bills where if your child doesn't test at a certain level after X number of years using ESAs, not only will you be forced to move back to the public school, but without any recourse, like you can't go back. Mm-hmm. So good luck. You couldn't even go back to homeschooling if you wanted to, but you may have to pay back the money.
Yep.
So, they're putting conditions attached to your kid. If your kid doesn't perform, then with these private scholarships, they sort of pay for success tax breaks that they're giving. Right. If a private corporation and their private little NGO school gives you a scholarship and your kid doesn't succeed according to their metrics and the government metrics, and they're going to be the same thing, then too, they can either kick you out, hold you back, do all kinds of things. It might go on the blockchain as your this child is, not really. And now it's going to follow you for the rest of your life, and you will not ever be able to escape that. So it's really a way, when they say follow the child, please internalize that to mean that the government has a new permission slip with school choice dollars to follow and track and keep records of.
It's all about
your kids' every move and healthcare decision, by the way, because that's going to be further embedded in this.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it. They want to be able to dictate your child's healthcare.
Exactly. So that's a big one.
But think about the long-term consequences of that. I know in my state, it was very much tied to the red flag laws, right? So that record follows the child. And then what happens when they, want to make adult decisions and they're old enough and they want to purchase certain things and they have this on the record.
Well, and I want to make sure that people understand too, that it's not just leftists who want oversight and regulation over where these, we want standardization, we want regulation. I'm sorry, I'm a taxpayer. And if you're going to be redistributing my money, even if it's a little bit of it, if you're redistributing it to private citizens and especially to private corporations for something called education, you better believe, just like all these people now going, yeah, Doge, I want to see where the money's going. Well, why wouldn't you want regulations to see where your money is going? So they're going to put people who are otherwise anti-regulatory state in this position of demanding regulations because they weren't given a choice but to have their taxpayer dollars spent in new ways across more sectors. And why wouldn't you want to know? So they say, well, we just won't have regulations. Really? So somebody might take the money and go to Disney World and you're okay with that? They're going to have it. They have 3 kids and each kid gets $7,000. And, it doesn't cost $7,000 for them to, let's say, to homeschool, $21,000 to homeschool or whatever. So what exactly are they doing with that money? You don't want to know?
Right.
It's just a first step towards universal basic income. I mean,
that is exactly right.
What is the kid learning from this process? That redistribution is how I get things. So I want to know where every single penny is spent. And that's going to mean that I, Deb, am going to want to know what you're doing with it.
Yep.
And I promise you, I don't actually want to know. But if you start spending my money, I do want to know.
Right. Because it's your money. You want to know how it's being allocated.
And it's yours and everybody else's.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's a huge point for people to understand that this agenda is, although, it's right now being labeled as a conservative right-wing talking point, this goes back so far. And this was, I mean, really in the 70s and 80s, we had Charlotte Iserbyt blow the whistle on this and say it would be pushed through the quote unquote right wing. The Republicans would be the one to execute this. But this was not a Republican or conservative agenda. It's just that we have so much money poured into this propaganda, and they're very clever at the marketing. So it's become, people identify with certain, people and labels and the marketing, and so they've been convinced that this is a Republican initiative. But no, it had to come through. So much of this had to come through the right, because there would have been too much pushback on the left if it was coming through the left. The right.
That's correct. And I believe, I know it's a little tinfoil hatty of me, but I believe that some of, Randy Weingarten's vein popping rage, is actually fake.
I think so too. That video.
I think it's BS.
Good, not even good acting. No.
No, it's not. And that segues very well into the next myth, which is it will keep the woke and leftism out of the curriculum. No more indoctrination.
Well, that's been debunked already. I mean, we've seen that. We've seen that my state, they banned critical race theory, and you still have it because they don't have to label it when they're teaching the kids. And again, when I pointed out with the homeschooling, right, if they have a standardization that they have to meet, those kids still have to take the test. And to pass the test, they have to learn certain things. And so it can be embedded and inculcated regardless of what you call it. So they're very clever with this, and this stuff, it can be really subtle, unfortunately. So yes, it's not going to get rid of that at all.
Well, and if it's out there and all these NGOs and private corporations, what if they have the Bill and Melinda Gates School for the Better Tomorrow? What if George Soros decides to open a whole fleet in rural America, not fleet, but like a whole set of schools, because rural America doesn't have private schools. What if he just pops them up? And of course he'll be 17 steps removed. So we'll have to, you and I will be sitting there diving down rabbit holes someday, following the money, who started this ed tech school in all these rural towns all over, middle America, where they didn't previously have private schools. And suddenly they're this great, wonderful academies with all these wonderful tech tools and AI. And it's so cutting edge. And these kids are going to be the students of tomorrow. And you trace it back and it's George Soros. And it was your tax dollars that provided the seed funding. I mean, how are you going to stop that? You literally can't. You literally can't, because the thing working against us, this is so frustrating and ironic, is that as much as there's the tyranny of, tell us what you're doing and tell us what's going on, and we need to, there's also the when they tune into the Constitution and they care about it is when it benefits them.
Yeah, they're
like, oh, if you're going to redistribute it, you have to do it equally. You can't pick and choose.
This is why I'm so against the Convention of States idea. I mean, I think they are much better at hijacking these things, so that the people who are in favor of collectivism and tyranny always do a better job. So yeah, I'm not in favor of that at all. But I think that this is a huge problem with the, So
there will be. I think parents haven't thought it through too. That they're saying, well, I'll be able to take some money to my Christian school and the madrasas.
And also when you point out these, exactly. When you point out all of these NGOs that could be tied to it, Soros opening a whole, consortium of schools throughout the country, but you also could have these other organizations like Fetzer, and they have their little offshoots, right? So it might not be labeled Fetzer, but they're teaching social emotional learning, and they're indoctrinating your children with this, so this is why you don't want to be pushing for, I'm okay with you having a specific parochial school, like if it's a Christian school and you know what it is, but I think the religion needs to be kept out all around, because otherwise they're just going to do the same thing, and you're going to have this theosophical education system, and that's what social emotional learning is right now. So,
and the Satanists are going to test it.
You know the what?
The Satanists will test it just for grins because that's what they do.
Right? They said
Yeah.
that they use it, the 1991 Religious Freedom Act to justify their religious sacrifices.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that people will test it, and if only for the lols, if nothing else. But the other thing is that, when no, I just lost my train of thought. But with the money being funded by the taxpayers
Yeah.
to go to these private schools, um, you still have the conflict of interest of the government is behind it.
Yep.
There is always, at every moment, the potential for whomever is in office to decide to add. And remember, because this will be done by regulatory agencies, it'll be done either at your state level by your state board of education, whatever. Not everything's going to be voted on. Things will come up, a little regulation will come up in the school choice office of the blah, 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 that you didn't get to vote on. They just suddenly woke up one day and said, oh, we have a new requirement that you have to do XYZ, blah, blah, blah. Now, that doesn't mean there won't also be laws passed or people won't try to rein some of that in, but you may be 2 years, something's been going on in your kid's classroom, and then like it's happened now. And people are like, wait, when did they put this in? How many parents have you met who didn't know SEL was even a thing? Didn't even know what's happening. It's been going on for over a decade. More than that. If you go back to Fetzer, it's been going on for like 30 years.
Yeah.
And parents never heard of it until like 5 minutes ago, because it's not like they made a giant announcement. Oh, we're going to completely shift away from teaching your kid knowledge and skills, and we're going to work towards making them empathetic, wonderful little global citizens. They didn't ask you. They didn't tell you. You think it's going to be different when the money that they have control over is going to these schools? So no, it's not going to get rid of leftism or woke curriculum or SEL or DEI or any of this, or sex ed or any of this stuff.
And also, if you think about all these corporations that have these public-private partnerships, I mean, if they're incentivized to, implement whatever DEI, ESG, woke agenda, you think that that's not going to influence how the education system is run?
And nobody can stay on top of all of it. So, the government can better than you, but they're not incentivized to do so. Their incentives are keep my donor base and my lobbyists happy. Right. And the more you just keep giving them your money and letting them spend your money any way they want, the less electoral power you have, not the more.
Right.
If we had all walked away from all of these schools after COVID and said, we're done. You locked our kids out for 1.5 years, almost 2 years. You made them cover their faces. You made them get experimental drugs to come back. You made them do all these things. If even 10% of parents said, we're out, that could have created political pressure to do something. But when everybody's clamoring the other direction, government, please come into the private sector. Pretty please. Please give me more money, more government cheese. They're sitting back on, this is awesome. Y'all have no power. You don't want any power. Apparently you don't want any freedom, because we'll just keep dishing out all these bennies to you, and you will be so dependent that you won't dare. Why do you think these federal workers are all crying in their soup right now? I don't know what to do. They're completely dependent like little children. They, the rest of us lost jobs during COVID. We're like, this sucks. But we didn't go like,
yeah. Yep.
So anyway, that's that one. The woke curriculum, even the people go, Trump is here now, woke is going away. I'm like, you're kidding, right?
Yeah, no, woke is definitely not going away. I mean, and so much of it, I think, was, I mean, that's a whole nother conversation, but I think so much of it was part of a Hegelian dialectic, just to, I really didn't even address it much, because I was like, this is a distraction, and it's to create the tensions. You've got the woke, and now you've got the anti-woke, and they're fighting each other while the agenda is just marching on.
Well, it serves that. Why do you? I told people there's no coincidence that suddenly there's so much support for growing the government and giving them access to education like this.
Yep.
And it won't just start at 6. They're going to start at 3.
Of course.
And, then eventually it will be, babies, daycare, and you can have this. And once you have universal basic education funding from, birth to, graduate school, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump to universal basic income.
Yep.
Universal basic, slavery. I mean, just plug into the matrix, Courtney. You'll own nothing and be happy. It's great.
It's great.
Yeah. And then that
I
again,
was asking, I'm wondering, the guy who's on the cover, like
yes,
that meme. I'm like, I wonder how much they paid him. Does he get royalties for that?
I know, exactly. So the next one is, which kind of goes hand in hand, it will free kids from failing schools.
Yeah, this is such yeah, but like this is such a lie. This was the big argument I had with my with my legislators, as they were just saying that, well, sometimes the argument there was mostly about homeschool, and they were saying that, but it applies across the board, right? Because you will always have the kids who excel in spite of the terrible circumstances, and you will always have the kids who have been, even in the best of circumstances, will fail. So
Right.
this is just not, and money does not solve problems, right? There are some problems money can solve, but the money does not fix the education. We've
No.
seen this. We can go across the country. Some of the most well-funded schools have the worst education, and we're seeing the worst outcomes. So it's clearly not how much money do they have problem.
No. And I think what some people say when you bring up that it's not a money problem, they'll say, no, but it's the good kids can migrate away from the bad kids, the bad schools, whatever, and they will be rescued. They'll be saved. Well, that again presupposes that they, that the school is failing solely because of behavior issues, as opposed to the behavior issues are a function of the school failing.
Right,
And
right.
maybe those same kids would do better someplace else.
Mm,
Also, what's your definition of failing?
right.
So if your definition of failing is my kid can't read, they're
Mhm,
going into sixth grade, they can't read properly. They
mhm.
can't do math. So like, that might be my definition. But if yours is there are fights in the hallway every day, but I really have no idea if my kids are reading, I just don't want them to get beat up.
Uh-huh.
Um, that school choice may or may not solve that problem.
Right.
And it's not an automatic. You have to define what you mean by fail. You have to understand that previous attempts to rescue kids from academically failing schools have failed like
Yes.
spectacularly. The charter programs have been a mixed bag. Some charter schools have been great for kids and have done wonderful things. A lot of them have not. A lot of them have turned out to be real estate scams, been poorly trained teachers, not doing consistent teaching from classroom to classroom. And remember, school is, at least in this country, from a legal standpoint, a 13-year exercise
You're
minimum.
freezing a bit. Hang on.
Can you see me? Is it
Yeah.
still
Yeah, I see
okay?
you. You're frozen. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, there you
So
are. You're back. Okay.
if you take this money
Yeah.
and you commit to a school, and maybe that school, because we don't have enough private schools to go around for all the kids, let's say in Texas, who want these things. And you pick a school and it's not tested, it's not tried and true, right? It's brand spanking new. 5 minutes ago, they opened their doors. You have no idea if your child will be able to go through the whole 13 years. In other cases, schools will open with all good intentions. And I've even visited some that look wonderful and they're really trying to do the right thing. They're charter schools. And they don't have what they need to go the whole time. They can go through like fifth grade, or they can go through this. So now you have to move your child again. And I'm not saying that's bad. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. I'm just saying, don't be so certain that
Right.
wherever you go is where you'll stay or what will work for your child. It was not necessarily going to be any better a fit than where they are now. And just because you have money in your hand doesn't mean you are going to find, if you don't know really what you're looking for and you haven't defined fail, succeed, etc., by your terms. And if
Yeah.
you're going to define it by your terms, why are you going to ask the government to define it by theirs?
Right.
Why
Well,
would you even ask that?
or why would you assume that your definition is going to line up with theirs?
Exactly. Exactly. Somebody over, let me see if I can pull it up on the screen here, because this is a really, really good point. So Casimir says, school choice works well in the first few years before the state starts enforcing control, right? It always starts, it's like a pyramid scheme. It always starts okay. And people are like, isn't this great? And then they come in because they can. And then he also said the real choice should be to get tax deductions based on educational spending. And I've said this from the outset. If it were any of the things they claim it is, these myths that we're debunking, if it were free market, if it created competition, that's all it would be. It would be, oh, you're opting out? Okay, opt out. Check a box. I opted out. Here's how much I spent on education. I opted out. They don't charge me that tax.
Right.
And especially if we moved away from property taxes,
Yes.
and we're funding with like lotteries or something else, where it's more of a voluntary tax, then it's really a real opt-out. It's not just I'm paying for part of it, but I got to deduct this little amount. It's I paid for none of it.
Exactly. The whole property tax shift, is it's really one of my pet peeves, actually. So just for people to conceptualize this, people think you buy a piece of property and now you're like, I own this land. I own my home. But what happens if you default on your taxes? You essentially lease the land from the government is what you do. You don't own it at all. You own nothing and be happy, right?
And they have an unlimited authority to raise it, do whatever they, change it, etc. Throughout the whole time you're alive.
Absolutely. And I mean, what's going on now with these, what they're trying to do with conservation easements and all of that, but that's a whole nother discussion. But I understand what the founding fathers initially had property taxes, because that was like the definition of citizenry. So only people who own property. So you had stake in the game, right? So you were funding the government, and then you would vote, right? That was your kind of entry to vote. So it was a very different thing. It was about it was about having stake in the game. But now it's the complete opposite. You pay, and then they tell you what you can do, even though you're paying for something completely different. The fact they've shifted this over to be about education, that they're taking your property taxes and using it towards education. What is property? What if you have no kids and you buy a piece of property? Why should you be paying for the school?
That's right.
It's a complete bait and switch. It's really
exactly. And this is a comment I kind of want to address, even though it goes back to the last point, because I think this is important. It goes hand in hand with the sort of who's calling the shots. And so Shelley says, I'm not into the woke stuff, but I studied and worked in early childhood education. It seems to me that at this age, they need social emotional guidance until they're ready to focus on higher learning. I think the issue, Shelley, is if it's real choice. In other words, that's not the government is taking the money and the government's redistributing the money, and therefore the government's setting the standards of what social and emotional learning looks like.
Right.
Okay. Then I might even be inclined to agree with you. If a parent says privately, I need to go to work and I need somebody other than me or a member of my family to watch my child, so I'm going to go hire an early childhood education or send them to a center or what have you, and it's completely private. It's my dollars, and I've looked over their curriculum and I've looked over how they'll socialize my child and what kind of social and emotional programming they have, and I think it's okay. It aligns with what I would do if it were me. That's fabulous. Terrific. Let the parents choose it, because ideally what you were doing as an early childhood educator is kind of replacing what the parent would do if the parent were the early, the person at home going, here's manners, here's this, how we regulate our emotions and all that. But in the absence of the parent, you're replacing them. If the parent's making that choice and reading all the stuff and checking in and looking at all the reports, then wonderful. I would agree. The problem is if it's school choice dollars paying for it, or, I put that school choice TM, like trademark, it's really taxpayer dollars run through the government with strings attached to say, this is what social and emotional learning will look like.
Yep.
Or else.
Yep.
This is what lessons you will teach. This is what we want the kid to be socialized to think, believe, etc. And that's what we have a problem with. We think there's a conflict of interest having the government have such a role in parenting at that early, well, at any stage really, but certainly at the early impressionable age 0 to 7. Like, I don't want the government involved in socializing my kid. Sorry, it's just a thing. I don't think it's they don't have their best interests at heart.
No, I definitely don't think the government should be involved in that. And it shouldn't be forced. That's the biggest problem. When the government's involved, it's forced. So a lot of these social emotional learning programs, what they're really doing is trauma bonding. And that's, if you decide that that's something you want for your child, I personally wouldn't want it. But if you decide you want it, that is your decision to make. You should have purview over what your child is experiencing at that age, but it should not be forced on everyone.
Good Boy says the very last thing a free people should want is agents of the state apparatus being in charge of what their children are taught to think and believe. Nothing is more dangerous for the future. I couldn't agree more. And then this is getting back to sort of the money issue. Casimir points out there's an interesting example with New Emerging King. X for boys, the amount of money required per student is likely much lower than people expect once you make it donation based and focus on mentorship and self-teaching. 100% accurate. We've seen time and time again private programs that do amazing things that really do save kids from, so failing education and, poor environments for learning and so on. And they're doing it in half the time or less.
Yeah.
And on a fraction of the cost. So what this government's doing with school choice is they're taking as the baseline what we would spend in the public school, which we've just said is probably too much, right? Because they're paying for a lot of things that have nothing to do with instruction, have nothing to do with the classroom. And now we're going to give you a portion of that. But that's what our starting point. They're not sitting down and going, what does it actually cost to educate a child? That, guess what, should be the parents' decision. Parents, like I homeschool. And if you said to me, well, here, your portion now, you're in Arizona or whatever, here's your portion, $7,000. Or even if in some states are like, it's 3,000. I don't spend 3,000 homeschooling my kid. I could come up with ways to spend it, but if it were my money, I'm going to do it responsibly, and I'm going to spend as little as possible to get the highest quality I could possibly get. That's market forces. That's how that works. That's what real choice does. And then that in turn creates real competition for high quality, lower cost options, et cetera, and so forth. One thing I've shared with people frequently on this channel is that gymnastics centers, aerial places, horseback riding, all of these extracurriculars that rely on, kids for their income, but the kids don't get out of school till 4:00 in the afternoon. They have the whole day. They got rent to pay all day. They have to heat the place or cool the place all day. So they open their doors to homeschoolers and they reduce the rate because they know that we don't have, the deep pockets necessarily. Let's say they have a school program or whatever, and they give it to us for peanuts. I was paying like $10 a shot, each time to take my kid horseback riding. If you tried to go to the after school program, it was
wow, how cool. Yeah, that's so
because
smart.
they're like, we want them to come in the off hours. There's bigger competition for those little bitty hours because the government is forcing people into these little time periods, time slots by
more. I think you probably get more out of it because it's not like after a long day of sitting at, staring at screens or right. It's in the middle of the day and they're fresh and oh, that's awesome.
So that happens quite a bit. And, actually, it maybe the one he's got right now, which Shelley says, dang, I wish my son's martial arts class did that. Maybe it doesn't currently, but I bet you if you could go network with some other homeschoolers in your area and you went to them and say, we got 6-10 people here. Would love for you to offer a class in the middle of the day at a reduced rate for a group class of homeschoolers. That's what they did with the gymnastics center. That's how they did it. They were just going to close down and send their workers home and just be like, I don't know, we'll turn down the AC until we have to turn it on again. And people went and said, hey, how about it? Would you open it up for us? And they're like, yeah, make some money. Yeah, absolutely. So they did. So you never know, you might be able to get them to do it. This is what the free market allows.
Yes.
Okay. Now, somebody might say, well, Deb, why couldn't the homeschoolers getting the ESAs do that? Well, here's what will happen. The same place that knows like these people are operating on a limited amount, because they paid money to the taxes, they're not getting whatever. Now they know they're coming in with a big wad of cash from the government. But what do you think is going to happen to the prices? They're not going to keep it low. They're going to, well, we can get more because they have money in their pocket. This is the same thing that happened to colleges. Do you think it's an accident or a coincidence that college tuition went like this after the federal government started guaranteeing those loans, amongst other things, also started giving grants and all this other stuff? No, it's no coincidence. This is not a free market. This is a blended market, a controlled market. I don't know what you want to call it. I'm sure Casimir would explain it better, but it's not responding to true supply and demand, forces or whatever. And so that's a problem. And what we now call a failing school. So back to the topic of it will free kids from failing schools. That definition is on shifting sands. Okay. What would you do, for the sake of discussion, if then a majority of schools started to be failing schools? I can tell you right now, a large percentage of private schools are not doing so well.
Yeah. Well, there are very few actual private schools, unfortunately. most of them have taken some government
right.
money, whether it's state
And
money.
their quality has gone down. And they're if they're accredited and the accrediting agency is working hand in glove with the government, which they are, then too they're getting less competitive in terms of their admissions. They're being more lenient on their grading. They're doing all kinds of DEI and SGG related things to remain accredited schools because parents for some reason think that that's necessary. No, it's not. And failing is becoming like a moving target.
Yes.
I'm seeing so-called honor students, I've said this many times, who cannot read a book from beginning to end.
Wow.
Yeah, it's not that they lack the decoding ability. They don't have the stamina. They don't have the initiative. Everything has been externalized. All their incentives are externalized. The grading is so easy at this point. They can get away with skimming it, cheating, using AI, etc. So they're not really expected to do the work that, let's say, I was in private school way back when. I know that for a fact. I mean, I've looked at different syllabuses and it's like you're doing in 10th grade what we were doing in 8th grade.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point about the stamina. I think a lot of that has to do with the what they're creating in terms of dopamine reward circuitry. So a lot of people think of dopamine as like an excitability, and neurotransmitter.
No.
But dopamine is actually biologically to incentivize people to work. So it's actually really about the it's the reward at the end is what you get, that dopamine hit. But it's because in terms of survival, you wouldn't want to endure like really hard labor just for the sake of it. But if you needed to do that in order to feed yourself, then you would. So that's really what dopamine is. But what's happened in our very modern, fast-paced society, and I think especially with children who grew up with everything is technological, so everything is the red dot syndrome, and so they don't have that ability for the delayed gratification. It's all has to be this instant, the constant hit. And for something like reading a full book, that kind of requires you to be able to stick there and
well, you have to be intrinsically, you have to be sort of internally motivated and have an inner monologue and have the ability to imagine things. And what do we know about passive entertainment? The more you consume of it, where your imagination is not engaged, you don't need to imagine, it's showing you. Everything is here. There's nothing left to the imagination. So especially at a young age, you don't build those pathways, and it's not just want, you need it spelled out for you, shown to you explicitly.
Well, it's really interesting. I see this I see this with adults actually, or really I see it a lot with with the young men today. We're seeing this movement of these, I call them pop intellectuals, but they kind of bloviate and they're very long-winded. And I think part of what the appeal is that part of a human function is our inner monologue, right? The ability to have an internal monologue and think, and it's part of how we formulate our own identity. And so thinking is so intrinsic to being human. And I think being able to read and write, it reinforces that, that critical thinking skills. And I'm not just talking about critical thinking in the sense of like discernment, which obviously is also worth developing. But I'm seeing now, so people will watch, long kind of sermons is what it feels like. But it's, intellectual in the pop sphere. And I think what happens is they feel it's much like going to see a movie where they feel like vicariously they've experienced those emotions. So they've had the experience of thinking, of having elaborate, developed thought processes, but they didn't do it. It was spoon-fed to them. But but as humans, we crave that so much because it is fundamental.
We've seen it this week alone. We've seen people say, oh yeah, this guy makes really good points. Maybe everything we've learned about World War II is false.
Exactly.
It's all lies. Because I watched a podcast and therefore, I've now decided, it's like, you did no scholarship. You did no research of your own. You've convinced yourself somehow that you're now in the know of something that has been concealed from millions of people across 80 years of time. And, when it's one of the most researched topics in the history of mankind. And you spent a couple hours listening to a podcast and now, you know the score. And
You
they actually believe that.
see
And
it.
it's amazing to me.
They
I'm sorry.
haven't trained doing that kind of
Yeah,
intellectual rigor, and so they're being fed it, and they think that that's equivalent to doing their own research,
that's
and
right.
so when you're talking about a whole generation of children who are being trained this way,
Yeah.
that's really, really dangerous.
Right. Yeah. This belief they know things or have had experience. And it's like, nope, you observed that. You were sort of vicariously, but that's not really you. Um, and then two, there is a huge disconnect I've noticed amongst my students between knowing how to do something at a very basic level, like read and write. What
Yeah.
do you mean I can write? I text all day. Um, and I read look, I can read all the stuff and they'll sit there and read to you. But what they don't understand is they have the ability to consume and to spit back things that they've consumed that they already know or they already relate to, but they don't have the ability to really acquire new information that isn't at their current level. That begins
Well,
to
and
calcify.
they
And
also
the older they get, the harder it is.
they don't have also the ability to synthesize.
No,
So it's one thing to be able to, spit back whatever, you already know and your argument, your stance that you've heard from other people. But
right.
it's very different to take in, as you said, new information and put that together and then
The
form
integration. Mhm.
yeah, the integration, exactly.
Yeah. Well, they're not really asked to do it. And so that's why I would caution you if you think that school choice dollars are going to free your child from failing school, you're putting the horse like
Yeah.
I mean, the cart is like down the block, the horse is on the other side of town. You need to first define what failing means and what success means. And you should be the one to define that. What the federal school choice program is going to do is allow private corporations to define success, create something called success, pay for success scholarships. And
Yeah.
that definition won't be your definition. You might hear the word success and go, yeah, it means like academic success, right? Well, like I said, right now they're handing out A's like candy to kids who can barely read and write. There are kids in college. You're like, how did I get to college? I can't read an entire book. And college professors are reporting the same thing. Are they successful because they were an honor student? Or are they failing because they don't know anything? Now, that should be your decision as a parent. And as the child gets older, as they're approaching their 18th birthday, that should be their decision. What
Sure.
does success look like to them? And I would argue actually that by ninth grade, they should start formulating that definition. But you know what you need in order to evaluate your next choices after school, after high school, and in order to decide if the education experience you've gotten has been a success, or maybe I need more, you need to be able to think and you
Yeah.
need to be able to look at what are my options out there? What do I already know? How do I compare and contrast the two? And what's missing? Can you do that if you've just been spoon fed information
They don't
and
e
said, this is it?
no,
Check the boxes.
they can't even ascertain what success is.
No.
I remember I'll never forget actually, I was in 2nd grade and my dad asked me, what success means. And I had to answer, I was like, "Well, I think it's really different for each person," you know?
It
Uh,
is. Yeah.
yeah, and I was like, "I don't think there's like a blanket. I think it depends on the standard you've set and your
Right.
priorities, like what are your values?" And, my dad was very, very pleased with my answer, and I was kind of surprised by his response, you know?
Yeah.
He was a pretty, he had very, he could be quite critical, so I was kinda surprised that he was so, like, pleased with my answer, and so I asked him about it, and he said, "Well, most people define success in terms of, money, like how much money you've made." And, I thought, "Oh, well, I guess if that's, like, your goal, then that would be successful." I mean,
Right.
I was 7 at the time, so
Sure.
but this is the thing, I think most children aren't being taught enough to be able to evaluate that, and as you said, who's defining the success? And if you're talking about these supranational corporations, most of them are defining success in terms of, their goals, and their goals are going to be aligned with these NGO goals that are really about creating global citizens, which is making the child a cog in a machine. This is all about, putting them into this workforce that's
Right.
eventually going to,
Workforce training. They
yes,
would love nothing more than for your child to answer having a job,
yes,
or having a well paying job. being employed. Okay. And they've been pushing that. That has never changed from Rockefeller on. It has never changed. They have tried and succeeded in convincing parents across this nation that the goal of education is employment as opposed to being an educated person. So that has enabled them to change the curriculum to suit their needs, government and the corporations, in terms of what they need out of their workers, which usually is compliance, conformity, don't ask too many questions, don't rock the boat, go along to get along.
That's what Rockefeller said the purpose of education was to breed compliance. Right. And this is the whole exportation of the Prussian model of education. This goes back well over a century.
That's why they talk about things like 21st century skills and workforce training.
Far back. I mean, it's not just 21st century, right? It was literally after the Battle of Jena. They lost the battle, in the Napoleonic Wars. It was 1807, and they decided it was because the soldiers rebelled because they were critical thinkers. And of course, I'm translating.
This is dumb. We're losing. We're going home.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And so they decided they need an education system that bred compliance. And that's exactly what they've done.
Exactly. So one more question on this, and then we'll move to our last one. So Nomo says, do you think that having tax dollars going to homeschooling parents and the equivalent amount per student spending would necessitate even more government oversight to investigate possible fraud? It would have to, and I don't think it would require equal funding. I think they could give homeschooling parents like $10 and they would use that to justify more oversight into what they're doing. And very, very quickly, because they'd have tons of pressure from the private schools and the unions. So they'd be getting from both sides. They would have tons of pressure to decide that the parents' education they were giving at home was inadequate, or they would suddenly classify fraud as, spending it on something that, the government didn't approve of, and so forth and so on. And there will be lists, just like with your FSA account right now, well, you can only buy aspirin if the doctor's prescribed it with your FSA, things like that, where they decide whether they're going to approve something. And some places it's very lenient, some places it's not. And it's still their choice, not yours. The ultimate point that we're trying to make here is this thing is called school choice, but it's
government school choice.
It is. It's not your choice, because if it were, it would be called education liberty.
Exactly.
It wouldn't be called school choice. The premise is you will pick a school. So homeschoolers who are still not going to pick a school, well, first thing that's going to happen is the state will not classify you as a homeschooler anymore. You will be called something else. They'll have a whole school. They've already done it.
Or the homeschool fall under these umbrellas. I mean,
that's right.
And you would think, I'm in Tennessee, you would think that's a super red state, and we have some of the most tyrannical educational measures. And homeschoolers, there's like 4 categories, but essentially the parochial category, this category 4, is the one that has the most quote unquote freedom, but they're still put under these umbrellas. And so like, if one child takes money, that whole umbrella is now subject to whatever regulations. So
even if you're not taking it, so that anybody out there, and I should have had this as another myth, but anybody who says, well, just don't take the money, it doesn't matter. If any kids in your school, that's why if there are parochial schools that have a special needs child in their school, and that child has to be, by law, has to get services. Through IDEA, that's a federal law. So if they can't provide them, they have to send the child back to the public district to receive those services. And as a consequence, that entire school comes under the umbrella of the federal control, because they had a special need kid who got services that a court actually decided that made them federally funded, even though they're not providing it at the school. And that's without school choice. That's without vouchers. That's just the current state. So people who are telling you like, no, it won't happen, are lying to you, because it is happening. It is already happening.
Absolutely.
So anyway, the last one that we had was, this is a big one. It's a step in the right direction. This is usually spoken in conjunction with, don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. You're such an idealist. You people, you want everything perfect. It's one step. It's incremental. When we do this, we're moving away from government control. It's a step in the right direction. You're in my way. You want to be in the way.
Oh, no.
of my steps in the right direction.
Well, I think it's exactly the opposite. It is a step in the direction of government control. So it
That's
is a step absolutely in the wrong direction, in my opinion. It is, it's this co-option of words. They hear choice and they see these, figures, these ambassadors who are attached that have been given all this, Koch brother money. I guess it's just one brother now, but, the Koch Foundation, sorry. But yeah, they're given this money through these, various think tanks and NGOs and all of these foundations, and there's so much pumped in. Then they prop up these various figures, and so people identify, oh, my Republican ambassador is advocating for school choice. That they're not even looking into what does that mean? What does school choice mean? It means that you are talking about government funds. So you're making all school, all education government run, and we know whatever the government funds, it runs. So this is not, it has not, you have school choice. There's a God-given right, I believe, but even if you don't, you have a right as a parent. When you birth your child, you dictate until that child is of whatever age, in this country it's 18, but you have a right to decide how your child is educated. If that means you're doing, you have them at home and you have them as an apprentice watching you. I mean, that is what they used to do, right? You would have family business and the child will be learning the business from a very young age, doing whatever, assistant tasks or watching. And if that's education to you, then that is your right to educate your child in that way. If you want to send them to a public school, this is your right as a parent. You decide to decide now that because you put the label choice that suddenly the government decides, or they've given you this little buffet. It's you pick the red, green, it's chocolate, vanilla, it's still ice cream flavors, right? What if you don't want ice cream?
That's right. And I really think what people don't see is how much this benefits everyone but the family, everyone but the parents. So, really step back away from your desperate desire to make this something it isn't, like it's a solution or it's going to get my kid out of the school that I don't like, or I'm going to have this money and everything's going to be better. Just take a step back and ask yourself, why are all these very wealthy, very well-connected, highly political think tanks and lobbyists and big corporations, why are they so gung-ho for this? Why are they suddenly so all over this? Do you genuinely believe they're doing it because they just care about you from the bottom of their heart? I don't mean to sound so cynical, but you really need to. We're talking about politicians. We're talking about people who demonstrably do not have your best interests at heart. They have their best interests at heart. Why do they? And you might say, well, because they know that we'll vote them in office if they rescue us and they saved us from this thing. Really? Is that the way you get reelected? Or is it to actually reduce your electoral power so that you can't ever vote them out of office, California? I mean, if that were true, California would be much freer because it's a beautiful state. Who doesn't want to live there? Right. I mean, people were miserable there and they still don't want to leave in many cases because the weather's so great. So did they get in all these people and promise the moon and then make life better for them so they would get reelected? No, they got in and made life better for politicians and almost impossible to vote them out.
Yep.
And that's how they did it. And this is another vehicle. School choice is another vehicle in states that would never go for California style, what's it called? Disenfranchisement, right? These little subtle ways that they do it. So they're going to do it through what does appeal to you. They're like, what appeals to conservatives? What appeals to Republicans? Oh, yes, this little thing called school choice, this little thing called, parental rights. We'll call it that. Kind of like they call SEL character building. Yep. So they literally had a meeting. The people who sell SEL programs had a meeting. Yep. And they discussed how to sell it to red states and conservatives. And they said, we'll call it character training. Yep. Exact same program. So school choice is.
They did the same thing with school choice back in the late 70s and 80s. I mean, that's what I'm saying when I'm talking about these. Who's behind like Project 2025, right? It's all the same organization, the Heritage Foundation. It's all this Mont Pelerin society offshoots.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Project 2025 because, I want to remind the audience that I did a show with Jake Kleisig and we talked a lot about that the last time. But in terms of these myths, one of the myths we didn't really go over, but it's still important, is that Donald Trump is dismantling the Department of Education.
Yeah.
And a lot of people say it's because of school choice that has put pressure on him to do that. And now he's got a federal school choice plan. And isn't it great, Deb? They're going to dismantle the Department of Education. Don't you believe it? They are redistributing the Department of Education. The Department of Education is just a building housing the functions and the distribution of funds. So their data collection and warehousing of data from all the states and the distribution of funds in accordance with federal law. So title funds, ESSER funds, and IDEA funds. Okay, that's about it. And they do supposedly hear disputes and like complaints, civil rights complaints related to education, but we know they don't do anything about them. So traditionally they've done nothing because there's no teeth. The parents are the only enforcers, and the parents report, and this Department of Education doesn't do anything. So all he's doing, per Linda McMahon, and she explained it in her confirmation hearings, all he's doing is they're going to redistribute the same things, but to the Department of Labor, the Department of Defense, the Department, the Health and Human Services. And so now what you had trouble monitoring and keeping track of and wondering what the frick are they doing with schools in one department is going to be farmed out to 4 or 5. And even Donald Trump said recently, Laura Ingraham was covering it. He said, we're closing it down, but we're not firing everybody. We're going to keep the good people. We're going to keep the best people. What he's not telling you is they're just going to take the people who were already instrumental in running these little portions and send them to work over at these new departments. Their new office, their old office is closed. Their new office is going to be in another office building in DC. And yet, for political reasons, they're calling it dismantling. They're shutting it down, blah, blah, blah. They're not shutting shit down. Sorry, guys. ESSER's still there. Title legislation is still there. And until anybody repeals that, the funds will still be appropriated. They have to be by law. And they have to be distributed. And the difference is now that you've got Donald Trump in office who says, we're going to distribute them according to these new school choice rules to our friends in private corporations. Now, what happens if we don't get if there's a Democrat who comes into office? They'll have the same power, but do you think they're going to distribute them to some left-wing organizations?
Of course.
Maybe, perhaps. Okay, so that's the problem, is you're giving power out and you think it's going to stay in the hands of people you like right now. And even that's pretty bad, because why do you want corporatism and corporate fascism? But it's not. It will very quickly turn around to going to people you don't like, probably even under this administration, because they're not going to keep track of everything as closely as they can't. Or if they get too political about it and say they're only giving it to Christian right-leaning NGOs or organizations, there'll be a lawsuit. Says you're using taxpayer dollars. You can't do that unequally. You have to give us a good reason that doesn't have to do with our unpopular speech.
That's right. And, they don't even, let's say they were to dismantle the Department of Education, which is, as you've just very well laid out, that's not the case at all. They're forcing it, which makes it even harder to track and creates all sorts of other problems. But let's just say hypothetically they were to do that, then it still wouldn't solve the problem. You still have all of these, voucher funds and all of these, and you still have all these laws, all these, like we talked about last time, like compulsory education laws. And so it's really not going to solve the problem. They need to, there needs to be major legislation.
And now the states, he says, I'm going to send it back to the states. No, because if he were doing that, like I said, he would dismantle, he would ask Congress to repeal these laws, and he would literally take the federal government out of the education business. But by doing it this way and creating a brand new federal school choice program, he's actually putting more federal control into the states, because now the states are going to be scrambling to, what do we need to do? How many schools do we need to open? Come on, corporations, come here, open schools so we get federal money in our state so we can go. So, the Tennessee governor can be like, I was able to secure X amount of federal education school choice dollars to my state. Elect me.
He's on it.
No, and Utah's on it, and Oklahoma's on it, and all of these supposedly red states, with the exception, ironically, of Florida, they're all over this. And, people are being fooled.
Yep.
They're being fooled into believing this
Florida already
benefits
has
them.
a failing experience, so there's a lot of pushback. Yeah.
No. And so that you have these valiant fighters in Texas in particular. Wow, they are fighting so hard. I mean, really, but those of you listening, if you're in Texas and you're on team no school, anti-school choice, you have my heart, because these people are fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting, and they are getting abused, slandered, libeled, doxxed, threatened, you name it. And these are lifelong Republicans, lifelong conservatives, even some libertarians who are stepping up and saying, this is not the way. And, at great cost to themselves. So just like with people fighting the masks and fighting the vaccines, has become a very unpopular thing to oppose, unless, of course, you're Randy Weingarten or you're already on the left and they're faking it. Because why would they oppose it? It's giving them so much power. Remember, guys, who educates the teachers? Where are the teachers coming from to be in all these schools?
These teachers unions. Yeah.
Now the teachers unions they have a case for why these private schools should hire union employees. How can they justify not hiring them? They're taking taxpayer dollars.
Exactly. Yeah, I think again, this is that's why I say I think it's just this Hegelian dialectic. The left is against it so that the right will be for it, and
That's
people
right.
don't investigate. They just look at the labels. It's wrapped in this nice little banner, and like,
Exactly.
oh well, I'm with this one. I want the red bow, and I'm against the blue bow, or vice versa. And so you're not looking at what's inside, and that's
the push to regulate homeschool will be overwhelming and fast. It'll be so fast, it'll make your head spin, because as Nomo pointed out, there already is a movement. I mean, there's been one, the people at Harvard have been dying to end homeschooling. And then you have, and they're pretty well connected. And then you have a lot of people, even amongst Republicans, who are saying things like, well, parents can't necessarily do the best job. And I don't think they can. Look, it goes without saying that not every parent can or even wants to do the teaching of their own child. Even homeschooling parents will outsource some of that. They'll find tutors, they'll find a teacher for math, and they'll do the English, whatever. They'll send their kid to a co-op. I mean, classical conversations exists to create an environment so that the child isn't just sitting at the kitchen table with mom. So these things already exist. And yet, because the people seeking to regulate homeschooling and fund it and then regulate it through the funding don't know what homeschooling is, and they don't understand it, and they don't even try to learn about it because they're too eager to regulate it out of existence because it's actual freedom, they will characterize it as something it isn't. They want everybody to imagine it's the Duggars sitting around at the kitchen table and mom's doing all the teaching, and mom can barely tie her shoes or something because she's, a homeschooler, and we're all dumb, right? We're just like hayseeds. And they're wrong. And when you think about these parents who say, I can't teach my own kid, like, where did you go to school? Public school. What? So you were taught by the government, and now you don't feel qualified to repeat what you were taught to your kids. Just chew on that one for a little while. But they want you to believe that every homeschooling parent is an abuser or is too dumb to do it themselves, especially with this high tech stuff, because surely homeschoolers are so low tech. They don't know how to do anything. And that push is going to come hard and fast with this money.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm seeing that. That's what I've been, fighting in my own state. And that was the argument they gave me, was about how so many parents will just fail and they just won't educate their children. Of course, I asked them if they thought our founding fathers were erudite. And of course they said yes, and I said, because it is a red state, quote unquote.
Right.
And I said, well, do you think they had formal education? Which of course they did not. And I said, so, that's a kind of case in point that formal education does not. And then I flipped it. I said, well, how many, like post college graduates do you know, like people with master's degrees or, advanced degrees who are not very erudite at all, right? They're not well educated. And of course, we all have seen that. And so it's really there's just always going to be the cases of, parents who, as you said, they don't want to educate their children, and somehow they succeed. Obviously, we would hope that they do the best for their children. But there's also the opposite cases. There are these, cases where their children have been given every advantage possible, and they they don't succeed in spite of it.
Right.
So
Right.
it's just not. But I this idea that homeschooling has to be like this mom around the table, and it's so. First of all, I don't think that that's even that's just doing public school at home. That's
That's
not
right.
right. We
That's
don't.
right.
That's the opposite of what we want. We want there to actually be real education that could be
Right.
immersive, and that could be also somewhat not precision AI, education, but that does take into consideration that different children have different strengths, different interests, different passions, and so maybe that doesn't mean that you don't teach them math. They still need to
Right.
learn their foundational skill, but maybe
Right.
when they're really interested in something, you give them a little bit more chance to
That's
maybe
right.
they do research projects as they get a little bit older. But even, I mean, when I was really young, I did research projects. They look different then when I was 4 than they do now. But,
Yeah.
maybe like when I was like 3, 4, I was obsessed with the rainbow. So I started studying like what makes the different colors in the rainbow, and I took that initiative, and kids really will take the initiative on things that they're interested in. But a lot of times when they're in government schools, whether it be private, public, but because they're regulated, they don't have the ability
Well,
to.
initiative is drummed out of them because every minute of their day is scheduled. There's a lot of wasted
They're not
time.
even allowed to. They
No.
don't have the opportunity to pursue things outside of whatever,
No.
even if it's
Or
just
they do, but it's in the wrong, because I'll have teachers say to me like, well, that's not true. And they have all this free time to do this and that. I'm like, but that's maybe after 3 hours of sitting and twiddling their thumbs or doing what someone else wanted to do. They're tired at this point. Their sort of initiative is on someone else's schedule.
yeah.
And that's not really how it works. The other problem is they're surrounded by people arbitrarily put around them
Yes.
at all times. And that's not going to change with school choice. You may be able to choose the building, or you may be able to choose, what side of town, like I said, but you're still not going to be able to choose the kids down to the individual kid. Maybe if you go to a micro school, you can, but very quickly, even the micro schools will be regulated. So all of this might be super duper for about a year or two. And it will, if it's not
More
already
optimism.
going to be regulated. And I'm being generous. I'm being
Yeah,
generous.
my God, that's more optimism than even I have. But
Yeah, like I said, I only say that because I know there'll be somebody out there in the audience says, I am taking vouchers right now, and my child is going to a wonderful school, and they're
Sure.
just fabulous, and they've been rescued from blah, 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 blah. And I know these people exist. And then I was like, okay, well, let's check back with you in
Right.
5 years.
Exactly.
Okay. And are you really going to pay such close attention to every last little regulation and thing? I don't mean to be a jerk, but what I've found is that a disproportionate number of parents will, believe the teacher about how well their child is doing, and they don't check.
Right.
They don't independently verify that A is really an A.
Right.
By some metric that they would set. This is something I really am glad that my dad was such a hard ass because it was a common thing that he would do, that he would just sit there at dinner and he would hand me a book, a random book, and just say, turn to page 55 and read it to me.
Oh,
and
wow.
I'd just be like, why? What? Just do it. And I'd be like, okay. I'd open the book, blah, 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 blah. Okay, fine. What did you just read? And then I'd have to explain what I just read, and he'd be like, all right, fine. But he would do that frequently, or he would make me write my papers for him. So I'd have to write. He said, what is your assignment? I said, I have an English paper. All right, bring me the draft. And I'd be like, but I've got to turn it in no, I want to see it. I'm going to see it first. And a lot of parents don't do that. Some will say, well, I can't because it's all in the Chromebook, or they did it in school. They don't bring work home, whatever. They're keeping parents away. Well, if the school you choose isn't suddenly, pen and paper and everything comes home and we use books and all that, or if they do that, but you're still not going to look, and then suddenly the books go away. How many parents said, wait, where'd the books go? Do you remember it was like 10 years ago? They were complaining about kids are breaking their back with these giant backpacks. They're getting back problems because they're carrying so many books. And then magically the backpacks were empty. It's not that, it's like, people were like so glad the kids weren't breaking their backs anymore. They stopped asking, like, where did the books go?
Dumb. Who started that narrative? Because I remember that. I was like, this is just really, really, really kind of
Probably the
asinine.
people who knew they were about to get rid of all the books.
I guess so, but I mean, it's like this, when they say like, "Oh, children shouldn't lift weights." I mean, it's we know that that's just factually incorrect,
Right.
and so and they put all this fear. Oh my goodness, they're
Yeah.
carrying backpacks. There were children once upon a time that were working out in the field, like carrying hay bushels, like they didn't break their backs. This is just such
No.
a I don't
They
even
start sending with little like rolly bags, like they're going to the airport with their book bag.
I
And then those went away. Like I said, it was almost overnight. There
It
was this
was,
huge
yeah.
push. And then suddenly I remember the first time my kids came home from school. This is after they were homeschooled, then they went into school, and at first they had, backpacks full of stuff. And then
Right.
I remember the first time they came home and I said, "Well, where's your stuff?" Well,
Right.
there'd be like a green folder. And in the green folder were some slips of paper from the school about like all kinds of housekeeping garbage,
Oh.
permission slips, and download this app and something like, where are your books? Oh, we don't have those anymore. I'm sorry. What are you using? Well, we have a Chromebook and we have to leave it at school. And this is what happened. Yeah, because they couldn't bring the school's Chromebook home. And then suddenly parents were saying, well, I need to get my kid their own Chromebooks. Now parents having to run out and buy a Chromebook because they're like, I want to log in and see what the heck's going on. But plenty of parents couldn't afford to do that. So they're just like, okay, I guess I don't know what's going on. It's at school in the Chromebook. And I remember one of my first tutoring jobs locally where I had to physically go to the person's house. And the kid had a Chromebook to log into like Google Classroom, whatever. And we would spend half of every session trying to find the homework assignment because the teacher was so piss poor at using the technology they had just suddenly switched to that the kid couldn't find anything. And then when I finally would find the assignment, it was a hodgepodge of things pulled from the internet randomly and shoved into this Google Classroom. And like, here's your biology assignment. And I'm just thinking like, what in the actual...
I'm just thinking about this. This had to be really relatively recent because when
It was Common Core. Common Core is what did it.
Okay,
because with Common Core, they just had standards, and then
right.
all you had to do, there were no teachers didn't create their own lesson plans anymore. They didn't use like this is the approved textbook. It was like these are the standards you have to meet, and they could go out on the internet and find anything that would plug into the standards.
I'm trying to think what year, because when I lived in LA, like I was a tutor. That was like one of my jobs, and they all had real textbooks still.
Yeah.
And that really wasn't that long ago. So that is really interesting to think. It was kind of overnight.
And now even the Houghton Mifflin and all these, they do online. Everything is online.
Wow.
So they still exist. The companies still exist, and they've invested millions of dollars in digitizing and adaptive AI
too. They can change it too, right? Because it's digitized.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, because that's another thing, folks. If you think like, oh, in the school choice eligible, get ed tech and all this stuff, like, and they could literally change what's in the material overnight, and you'll never know.
Yeah.
You'll never know what's in the U.S. history curriculum from day to day. It's proprietary too. You can't, if you're not the student, you can't even log in and see what the heck's going on. And in some cases, they gatekeep. They make it, you can't see it. So, everything being in technology, you think makes it easier, but it actually makes it harder for you to oversee what the hell's going on. And school choice isn't going to change that. There's a whole bucket of things that exist now that make education a problem, right? That have nothing to do with where the money's coming from. Nothing whatsoever to do with it. And in fact, create an incentive to get their hands on that money. It's incredibly lucrative.
Yeah, of course.
They don't print paper books. They don't have to ship anything. They don't have to dispose of extra copies. They don't even have to really sell anything. It's memberships. Like, this much a month, or the school pays for this or that access, or the teacher pays. Things are downloadable, PDFs, whatever. It's so much cheaper to produce the materials. Once they've done the initial research and writing, they can distribute it for pennies compared to the books. And so they can make more money than they ever made before.
Wow.
And why not turn around? And yet they still charge a shitload of money for it. And so the profits are through the roof. There's an enormous incentive for them to do this, and then to create the curriculum in such a way, like I said, that it pleases the government. So the government will allow the dollars to be used to pay for it.
Yes.
So, it's not your standards that will be met. It's the people who hold the bucket of money.
Yep.
So the answer is don't give them your money. And you'll do, I can't, I don't have any choice. Well, start putting the energy that people put into getting school choice bills passed.
Yeah.
Imagine if that money and energy had been channeled towards getting rid of property taxes and getting rid of compulsory education. Imagine where we'd be.
This would be so much better. Yes.
So that's my answer to that. You're making the perfect the enemy of the good. I'm like, you never even tried. There is a perfect. You just admitted it.
Right.
So, but you didn't even attempt it. You said it's not possible. So let's do the next worst thing
Right.
than what we already have. Instead of saying, let's see, we got a few $1 billion to spend on some political campaigns and some lobbying, whatever. Let's lobby against school, these school laws. Let's do that. Let's have the truly free choice. We got COVID in the rearview mirror as our rallying cry. We don't ever want to go there again. Let's get real freedom. Let's go. I can almost guarantee you that would have had a groundswell of grassroots support across political lines.
Right. Of course.
What's unpopular about getting rid of property taxes?
Yeah. Right.
Yes, I miss the lack of popularity around that. Getting rid of compulsory school laws. Oh, yeah. What a terribly unpopular thing. Mind you, people are like, oh, no, then parents won't educate their children. Really?
That's the pushback that I hear. And that's what my state legislators told me. That, well, parents won't educate their children. That's why we have.
Wow. You have a very dim view of your electorate.
Yeah,
why do they feed them?
Pointed out that they actually, in their own state constitution, they contradict themselves because it says that there is no mandate to educate the child, that they have to provide an option. That's fine. And then at the end, they go and put a compulsory education. So I'm like, literally just in your own constitution contradiction.
So we've decided everyone's guilty without no due process whatsoever. It's like I said, there are parents out there who don't feed their kids, who don't take their kids to the doctor, who abuse their kids and neglect their kids. They exist. Okay. I assume the same people who abuse their kids in those ways are going to be the ones who don't educate them. Okay. Right. In fact, they're the ones whose kids are truant right now. And the schools have to chase them down. It's probably going to be the same pool of people. We already have things in place to deal with those parents called laws against child neglect. Right. And we have due process. So they're entitled to go and, have their day in court to explain how they are or not, neglecting their child. We do that with feeding. You could die without food. Okay. Right. You're not going to die because someone didn't teach you multiplication. I mean, I hope that they do, but why do we have more strict controls over parents around education than around feeding? And I'm not suggesting that we have them around feeding. Yeah, no. I'm just saying, can we take the education part back to what we already have for the more important stuff?
Yeah.
It seems to work. Nobody's complaining that we need inspectors to come in every day or for you to register what grocery store you're going to shop at and how many calories you're going to feed your kid every day. And you need to take a standardized medical test at the end of every year to prove that you've fed your child properly. Can you imagine?
Oh my gosh.
That's probably coming next.
Don't give me any ideas.
No. Anyway. All right, guys. Well, I hope we have, at least given you some stuff to think about when it comes to all of these myths. They are myths. You can go do your own research. Please do. Don't take what we're saying as the gospel truth. Look it up for yourself. That's the only way you'll really trust the information. And I would encourage you, when it comes to your kids and their education, you absolutely should do all the homework you can possibly do. So any final words, Courtney?
No, I think that, we covered it. I mean, just really essentially it's a big lie and it's a marketing campaign. They're very clever. School choice sounds like choice. It's really about making every form of education government run. There is nothing that is freedom minded about this. There's no choice in that. It's all just a different flavor from the same ice cream stand. So yeah, this is not really choice. It's very limited, and you have a choice. You have choice without the government involvement. So if you don't want to educate your child, I'm not advocating that, but then that should be a parental right. You don't want to educate your child? Fine. You think that, self-directed learning is a better way to go? That is your prerogative as a parent. This is not for the government to decide what is a better, outcome for the child. And what we've seen is actually the government does a much worse job in most cases. So, Yeah. And it's not just their education that suffers. It's this idea of the formal education where children are, I mean, now it's staring at screens for 8 hours a day. But I mean, this idea that children should sit in a chair for 8 hours a day. I mean, that alone is just a absolutely horrendous idea. I mean, would you do this? I know I'm gonna sound absurd saying that. Would you tell your dog like you have to just sit here for like 8 hours? I mean, it really is cruel.
Yeah.
Children they're growing, they're developing. So much of that is immersive. That's why children go and touch and look at everything, and babies put everything in their mouth. It's because they're developing, and it's a part of their exploratory process. This is actually how they learn. And so you rope them into a chair where they're told they have to learn X, Y, and Z. You ring a bell that traumatizes them. Oh, they get startled. It's time to go. It's time to go. And now they're in the middle of learning something, and let's say they were actually engaged and they were immersed, and now it's all jarred and disrupted, and they have to rush off because they're going to be punished otherwise. This is all about obedience and compliance. This is not about learning and about education. So that we already just have so much evidence from all these years that this is
why would you want the same people
yes
who are making you so miserable and that you want an out to be the ones running the out?
Exactly.
It doesn't make any sense. It's like going to your abusive ex-spouse and asking them to pick your next date.
Yeah, right. No.
Like, why would you do that? Please help me pick my next partner. Like, what? Yes. Tell me what requirements I should have to go, and in fact, give me, hey, ex who used to beat me constantly, give me some of the money you stole from me to go and on a date with somebody else. Oh, sure, no problem. But you have to go where I can see you, and you have to go to one of these 5 restaurants, and you can't report back. Sounds fabulous, doesn't it? But this is what we're doing.
Yeah, exactly what we're doing.
Most parents wouldn't deny that they feel sort of abused by the current system. Like, it's the same people.
Yeah.
Same people. Governor Abbott is the same guy who's in charge of the public system you hate so much.
Yeah.
Okay. So he's the one who, and one could argue, and again, I'm not pro public school, but that he purposely deprived it of funds to make it worse so that he would support his little boondoggle of school choice.
Right. Yep.
That there is an argument to be made that those kind of games are happening too.
Oh, yeah. I think so. Again, that's just the Hegelian dialectic. So
yeah. So it's a mess. And I just hope that people will give it some thought. We've been snookered for too many years, whether it was like Black Lives Matter. So you couldn't say, I don't support Black Lives Matter. Oh, you think Black lives don't matter? So you say like, I don't support school choice. Really? You don't support choice? And I'm like, yeah, that's what I said.
Right. Yep.
Anyway.
Same games.
It's always the same. Thank you so much, everybody. Please make sure you follow Courtenay and go to CourtenayTurner.com and subscribe and follow her podcast and all the things. Tell me the book real quick. I want you to talk about this book that's coming out.
Yes. Okay. So if you are following me on Substack, you can get a sneak peek at my rough draft. I have to format it to make physical copies, and I'm going to be adding a couple of chapters as well. But you can get a sneak peek of the rough draft, and it is about the Hegelian dialectic. So it's really funny because when I went to the state capitol to, talk to my legislators about the school choice initiative, that's actually what got me, labeled as the lady in the black fur who was not allowed back because she uses big words. And it was the
she uses big words.
Yeah, they were very upset with me. It was the Hegelian dialectic, of course.
Yes.
That these were the big words that they were. That was such an anathema to them. So I think it's funny.
But parents can't educate their own kids, but don't use big words.
But don't use big words. Well, I was kind of like, I think this is indication your public school education might have failed you if the Hegelian dialectic is too big a word for you. And I, of course, very naively, when I was explaining it, I said, we can do a 2-minute history lesson. And well, it doesn't, this can be fun. And then, we're talking about education, and I gave them a 2-minute kind of, really quick explanation. And, they told me I was using more big words and that they didn't know what I meant, and they didn't care. So good talk, good chat. But of course, they can't actually ban me. I didn't do anything to warrant that, and I have been back. And I actually called one of my senators and called him out on it, and of course he denied it. But anyhow, I did not intend to write a book on it. I was writing an article, and it was way too long to be an article. So it is now a book, and it is on the Hegelian dialect. And my thesis is that it is a Gnostic Jacob's ladder. So this is, I describe it as the Aufheben, which is, for those who are not familiar, it's a German word, and it's an oxymoronic term that means to lift up and preserve while simultaneously canceling and tearing down. And that is what creates the rungs up the ladder. And of course, for Hegel, he talks about the absolute is God. And this is really like complete subservience to the state. And he talks a lot about freedom, but freedom is an end versus versus free will, which is a conduit, a vehicle for potential to virtue. And they're very different. And people are very misled by this because they hear a lot of people talk about freedom. They're not talking about free will. That is completely different.
Sounds like the freedom that it talked about in Wrinkle in Time. When he's explaining when the sort of super brain thing was telling Charles Wallace, like, it will be so much, you'll be so much freer. It'll be so easy when you don't have to do the thinking, and I will do your thinking for you, and you will be free.
I have chills. A Wrinkle in Time was actually my favorite book growing up. Was it? Oh my gosh, my favorite. And I had a friend at the gym who used to train Madeleine L'Engle. And I was upset because I was like, you didn't introduce me. I could have tea with Madeleine L'Engle. But no, that's exactly right. That's exactly these people like Barbara Marx Hubbard and even Teilhard de Chardin. He talks about freedom. This is what he means. It's as an end, and this is what Hegel is talking about. He really believed that humans have no freedom without complete subservience to the state, and that was the end goal. I outlined this kind of history of ancient religions and their obsession with unification of opposites that has paved the way for Hegel's, codification of the dialectic. And then I talk about modern day and how we see it in things like school choice.
Exactly. So now those of you who haven't read Wrinkle in Time in a while need to go get your copy and read it, because it's one of the best books ever.
It is. And she wrote a whole series. What was it? A Wind in the Door, The Swiftly Tilting Planet.
Yeah. No, she was a genius and way ahead of her time in terms of using children's literature to do social commentary, in my opinion. I mean, I think that's maybe she would deny it, but that's what I think she was doing.
I don't know. I'd have to go back and reread it with the lens now to know if it was part of predictive program.
And then you have to read This Perfect Day if you haven't done it yet, because that's like the darker, scarier version. But you'll get chills from that too, because that one includes the drugging. That one includes the drugs. So that's Ira Levin. Those of you who don't know, who wrote Rosemary's Baby and stuff like that. But it's one of these lesser known books, and yet probably very relevant for today.
Yeah, that one I do think was operational preparation of the environment, for sure.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody. Please like, share, subscribe, all the good things. And we will see you next time. Take it easy.
Thank you.